All right. So welcome to Race, Place, and Inequality for the week of September 20th through the 24th. Let's make sure this is correct. Yes. September 20th, not September 20th through the 24th. See, that's not it. September 20th, 21st, and 22nd. Yes. So those are technically like your days, if you will. But this is for the readings, the white space, make sure, yeah, the white space as well as space for place and sociology. This lecture will be specifically over the white space, more over the white space than a space for place and sociology. A space for place and sociology, one of your classmates is doing that. You have, I think, one or two classmates may be doing that. I can't remember. So the information for that, I feel like, is pretty self-explanatory in that way. And essentially what Garen was trying to do was just prove why sociology was a discipline where we could talk about space and place, particularly place. So that's kind of what Garen is putting forth in that text. And I feel like the presentation / presentations that you're going to see on that will suffice in that way. Plus, I probably won't be pulling a lot from that when it comes to your exams and things of that nature. With that being said, though, white space, I do think is very important. And so we're going to spend for this lecture, we're going to spend time talking about white space and particularly the iconic ghetto. As one of Elijah Anderson's, he's a sociologist out of Yale. I heard him speak. He came to one of my first faculty appointments, was at Clark Atlanta University. He came there and spoke, very brilliant professor. And so he wrote this piece about the white space and the idea of the iconic ghetto. He also has another concept called the cosmopolitan canopy, which if you read the piece, then he talks about that as well. And we will probably end up reading something like that. We'll probably end up reading the cosmopolitan canopy at some point as well. So with that being said, let us go to the next slide. And I would like for you to watch this video. It's interesting. And after watching this video, I want you to answer these questions to yourself. I will go ahead and share it. If for some reason YouTube takes it out, because sometimes they do that. That's why I have the link in the slide, and then you can just watch it on, you can just pause the video and watch it on your own, and then come back to this lecture. But I will go ahead and share it. But we're going to watch this video, and then after we watch it, go ahead and talk about it, answer some questions about it. Let's see, where are we? Okay. Oh, I don't know. So yes. Thought it would pull up. Oh, here it is. Okay. Actually, let me do this. Because there we go, because I got to share the sound too. There we go. All right.
I'll give you 2.5 of my 10-piece chicken McNuggets for a quarter of your quarter pounder with cheese.
But judging by weight, mine's worth at least 4 chicken McNuggets.
From a cost standpoint, they're of equal value.
But I'm older, so.
Get 2 of your faves like 10-piece McNuggets or a quarter pounder for just $6, only at McDonald's.
Okay. So, after watching that video, whether you were able to watch it here or had to just click the link, So what would you do in that situation? So just, something to think about. What would you do in the situation? Or have you even been in that situation before, where either you were a person of color and you were subjected to discrimination by being followed in a store, or or something like that, or maybe you saw a person of another racial group being discriminated against, right? Being somewhere where they're not supposed to be, or because they looked a certain way, they got chastised, or they were ostracized in a way that other people who could be in that group wouldn't be, or could be in that space wouldn't be. How did the white people respond versus the Black person? Did you see a difference in the response? After watching this video, what did you learn about Black people in white space? So clearly that space appeared to be a white space, but there was also a class element to it as well, because first it was kind of like a white space, right? So you see predominantly white people, you think, well, people who could afford this more than likely are going to be white people who can afford a $600 jacket or $1,000 suit or something like that, right? But we also know that there are people of other racial groups that have money, that can afford, high-end things, right? So it was interesting. The young lady said he could be, I think she said, an entertainer or a rapper or celebrity or something, right? That there was kind of like some implication there as well that we could possibly even tease out. But needless to say, regardless of what the person's occupation is, there are ways in which people can make a lot of money so that they can afford those things in the store. So there are these racial implications, but then there are also these kind of class nuances as well. And so it got to the end where the gentleman was Black, but he was not accosted in the same way that Damon was, who was dressed up, like a street guy or a thug or whatever, the, fake locks and everything. He was dressed in a looked like a business suit. So he's almost kind of saying, though because I'm Black, I look like I don't deserve to be here. I'm going to wear this nice suit. I'm going to wear this nice jacket, so that maybe that'll give you the hint, like, oh, well, he's Black, but he might be one of those rich Blacks. So we won't bother him, right? And he knew that. That's why he said that at the end, if I was here in my ball cap or dressed, similarly to how I would normally dress, I've been, subjected to discrimination before. So you see these kind of race and class things happening here. So something interesting to think about, something to talk about with your roommate or mom or, spouse or kids or whatever. And, kind of like what we saw there. And so with that being said, I want to just dive right into to some of the main points of this reading. Number one or two is white space and Black space. And then number three, we're going to talk about the iconic ghetto, right? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is white space. And white space is essentially settings previously occupied by white people, such as white neighborhoods, schools, universities, workplaces, restaurants, and other public spaces, which Black people often consider to be off limits for people like them, right? So that is essentially what we call white space. And so Black people typically perceive settings as white space because they often believe that they're not for them. Even if they can afford it, even if legally they should be able to be there, even if they are able to be there, they still consider it a white space. Even if you talk about universities, right? Universities, even if you look at UNF, the way in which UNF was built and why UNF is built where it is in the city was because of white space. It was not ideal for them to want to have African Americans in the northern part of the the city where the more poor and working class African Americans tend to live in Jacksonville, they didn't want to have the university downtown so that they can have access to it. So there's a reason why it's on the south side. There's a reason why it's in an area that is more middle class, by the beach, more white people. It was built that way. Obviously, over time, civil rights movement, opportunities are extended to African Americans. Now you have people of all racial groups that attend UNF, but it's still essentially a white space because its initial creation was for that, right? It was for white students, white college students, right? And so that is why they say universities, because initially the major universities outside of historically Black colleges were created for white people, right? So again, you can have spaces that now allow people of color or now allow Black people, but initially that was not what they were created for. So it's kind of an addendum, and people of color or Black people have to find their ways into those spaces. And so so that's why we say off limits for people like them, because some people may say, well, universities aren't just for white people, they're for everybody. You know, anybody can go. That's true, but initially that's what they were built for. Meanwhile, despite the growth of an enormous Black middle class, a lot of white people assume that the natural Black space is a place that is impoverished, that is fearsome, you know, areas that you will see in the media or in books or in TVs or music or movies or news. And this is otherwise called the iconic ghetto. And so generally when we see examples of Black spaces in movies or in TV shows or in the news, when you see Black people or a group of Black people together or Black spaces, more often than not, it is within these kind of ghettoized conditions, the poor neighborhoods, the working class neighborhoods, hanging out in the streets, hanging out on the corner stores, right? And so because this is typically what people see, this is the idea of Black space. Always impoverished, people always in fear, right? And so this then becomes the symbolization of the ghetto. And the ghetto then becomes a symbol of Blackness. And this is why Elijah Anderson calls this concept the iconic ghetto, because it looks at the ghetto as this icon of Blackness. And so white people typically avoid Black space, right? Because they don't want to be involved or associated with the ghetto in a way that is negative, maybe in a way that's cool. So sometimes when you have cool things that come out of the ghetto, maybe music or dancing or something like that, or whatever is popular in culture, it catches on to the wider culture, to the dominant culture. And so sometimes you may have white people that may use the slang or may listen to the music or may recite the lyrics or whatever, but essentially, but they don't necessarily want to live there or experience the same conditions, right, that a lot of people there experience, right? And so you have, again, this idea of the iconic ghetto, of liking it from afar, but not necessarily wanting to engage or associate with those people or the people in those areas or what that area represents. And then on top of that, there is this idea, and we're going to talk about this more later, there's this idea that this ghettoized mentality or ghetto culture or ghetto language or ghetto behavior applies to all Black people. So even if you are a middle-class Black person, even if you are a Black person of means, even if you are a Black person that has never lived in the ghetto or does not live in the ghetto, there, because the iconic ghetto is attributed to Black people, then it's automatically attributed to a Black person, regardless of their class. That's why Elijah Anderson calls it the iconic ghetto and not, you know, the actual ghetto or the ghetto reality, right? And so white people typically avoid this Black space physically, but may engage with it culturally. And that's probably the thing I would add to this. He says white people typically avoid it altogether, but not necessarily from a cultural standpoint. But Black people are required to navigate the white space as a condition of their existence. So white people don't have to come into contact with Black space if they don't want to. But white people don't have to come into contact with Black space if they don't want to. I think that's what I said. But Black people have to come into contact with white space at some point in their existence. Many times they don't have a choice. And so both spaces can be diversified, right? Both white space and Black space, nuanced and broken down even further along ethnicity lines and class lines. Ethnicity lines because the young lady said, I'm from Eastern Europe, and this would never happen in Europe, right? I've been to Europe a couple times. I've never lived in Europe, but I do know that Europe definitely has racism for sure, particularly against African people. But I don't know if they actually, yes, it does, because it happened to Oprah. I'm forgetting. Oprah was in Switzerland, maybe. She was going to Tina. I don't know if y'all know who Tina Turner is, but she's a famous rock and roll singer. And she was going to her birthday party, and Oprah Winfrey, and you can Google this story. Oprah Winfrey went to a very high-end store. I think it was Switzerland or somewhere. Went to a very high-end store, saw like a $34,000 purse. Obviously, it's Oprah, so she can afford it. So she said, "Hey, can I see that purse?" And the salesperson says, "I don't think you can afford that, but you can look at this purse." And Oprah kind of laughed, like, "Do you know who I am?" And so it blew up. It went all over the world. The woman, I think, ended up getting fired. Oprah said she didn't want her to get fired, but I forgot somehow the story got out. And so that just goes to show, right? This notion of shopping while Black, even somebody who is as well-to-do and as rich as Oprah Winfrey was subject to this same thing. Why? Because you have this notion of the iconic ghetto. The iconic ghetto says, Black, no matter how much money you make or who you are subject to ghetto conditions, meaning you're more than likely impoverished. So, these things are broken down along ethnic lines as well as class lines, right? Because the Black middle class gentleman, right? We assume he's Black middle class in the video, had on the nice jacket, the nice suit, understood I have to look this way in order to navigate this space with ease, or some relative, or with some relative ease, right? So there are these lines, right, that we have to consider. Also, if you're a Black person in a poor white space, may be different. You may not get the same treatment. You may get a different kind of discrimination, right? A poor white person in a high-end white place may get treated in a similar way as a Black person, maybe not get the cops called on them, but maybe seen as somebody who might steal because they came in without the right outfit on or didn't look like they had money, right? So there are these kind of ways in which it can be nuanced, but in these kind of broader conversations, you're more than likely to see this along these kind of racial lines, but it can get nuanced. So while the respective white and Black spaces may appear to be racially homogenous, and typically they can also be subclassified into these other social identities. So in order for us to really break down this idea of white space, I think it's necessary for us to provide some kind of historical context. I always think it's important to do that. Number one, because having this historical context and story allows us to see, even more significant or see even more the significance of the discourse, number one. Number two, this is a class that has sociologists, anthropologists, Africana studies, as people from various disciplines. And so I like to merge those together when we are, when we're having these kind of discussions. And so I want to start off with talking about basically how historically Black people have occupied a low space in the United States. And when I'm talking about historically, I'm just talking about the age of European expansion, right? Past that, we're talking a whole different thing. But within the age of European expansion, when Europe started to colonize and take over various parts of the West as well as the East, people of color, particularly Black people after 1619, occupied a low space in the United States, either indentured servitude or enslavement or as second-class citizens. So they always had this, lived in this kind of caste-like status. That's what Du Bois talks about. Even Isabel Wilkerson, I think you've heard me talk about her piece. I probably should require that at some point. Maybe I will another semester, but Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, New York bestseller piece just came out. I believe it was last fall. Talks about America as a caste system, right? And so Black people have always occupied that as a whole, generally speaking, right? Again, you do have some exceptions, but generally speaking, that's that status. So even if you go all the way back to slavery, you don't really have to make an argument about that. Even to Reconstruction, when we were starting to come up and when Black folks were starting to take on higher positions because of things like the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council, I think the Red Shirts and other groups that were more grassroots areas of the South, but were also backed and supported by politicians in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. Black people still could not fully express themselves as full and complete citizens during Jim Crow. And then definitely after Reconstruction, it was almost just like a step backwards. So you had 12, 14 years where it was getting better. And then Jim Crow said, we'll take you almost back to slavery, right? So Jim Crow, obviously there's a caste-like status that Du Bois talks about that African Americans live in. And then you have the Great Migration. And so this is the time in which Black people, and I believe we talked about this in a previous lecture, went from the South, migrated to the North, right? To occupy a different space, hoping that the Northern spaces would allow for mobility, would allow for them to have a class-like reality and not a caste-like reality. What they ended up finding, though, when they got to the North was, instead of being in a lowly space in the cotton fields and in the farms and in the rural areas, now they were confined to urban ghettos. So now instead of on the land, they're in these high-rise buildings, but they're living in these kitchenettes, right? And so if you've been reading Spatializing Blackness, he talks about that. I think we're going to go into more detail with kitchenettes next week. But he talks about these kitchenettes. Basically, you have whole families, multiple families living in one, maybe two bedrooms, rats, roaches, no lights, no water. It's pretty much no better than where they were when they were living in the South, right? And so you have these low level, low spaces that Black people are in, that Black people are living in, all throughout their time in the United States. Then you have the Civil Rights Movement. And so the Civil Rights Movement was this time that where you have this large push, and not only large push by Black people, but this time they were able to convince white people, liberal white people, people all across the globe, immigrants, people of other racial groups to join in this effort to create a better America for everybody, right? So the Civil Rights Movement turning into a human rights movement, there's this big push, and it leads to actual political change, because now you actually have acts, you actually have legislation that is put in place to protect people of color, protect all racial groups from discrimination, right? So the Civil Rights Movement ends up leading to increasing opportunities for Black people. But what we find is that the only Black people that are able to take advantage of these opportunities are the Black middle class. So if you're a Black person who already had money and all you needed was the opportunity to go to a new school or go to a good school or live in a good neighborhood, and the only thing that was holding you back was money, then when the law was passed, boom, you can go to whatever school you wanted to, boom, you can go live in whatever neighborhood. But what if you were one of those, and this was the majority of Black people at that time, what if you were one of those Black people who didn't have the money, who didn't have the opportunity, who didn't have the nice white person that would stick up for you and say, hey, let my friend in this school, or my friend should be able to live in this neighborhood, or whatever. Everybody doesn't have that white ally. And usually a person who would have that white ally would be a Black middle class person, not a poor Black person. So if you're a poor or working class Black person, that legislation really didn't do much for you, because now that you can go live with white people, you don't have the money to do it. You may be smart enough to go to a white school, but you can't afford the tuition. So it doesn't really matter, right? So this is why a lot of scholars, including William Julius Wilson, including Mary Pattillo McCoy, and so many others, argue that the opportunities for Black people were largely for the Black middle class, right? And so towards the end of the civil rights movement, this is when we see the murder of Dr. King. So Dr. King is murdered in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And when he gets murdered, riots break out in cities all across the nation, because they're saying, now this was the peaceful one. You kill other Black leaders, didn't like that either, but they were also telling people to take up and move in self-defense. You're going to kill the nice one. You're going to kill the one that told us to be peaceful. So this is when Black people began to riot and, break out and resort to violence or self-defense all across the nation. And so as Black people grew increasingly insistent and militant, it was in this context that the federal government said, you know what, we have to pass some legislation to make sure that we protect the citizenship and the citizenry of Black people in America. And so this is when you start to see them targeting for reform around segregated workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, universities in the end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s. This is when you start to see busing. This is when you start to see affirmative action. This is when you start to see the Fair Housing Act. You start to see all these things happening at the end of the 60s and 70s after these riots, right? And so now we're going to start to see why white space and the study of white space is important, because now more Black people are starting to actually understand what it means to be in white space consistently, not just go and work in a white man's farm or business and then leave, but now living and working and sending my kids to school here and going to these churches. Now it's going to be very, very different. And so again, what we see is, because of the racial incorporation process, now you have the Black middle class that has moved into these areas. And because now they have access to the schools, now they have access to the jobs, now they have access to the neighborhoods, the Black middle class starts to grow substantially, right? There's more of them now, because now you can send your kids to those schools, get those opportunities. And so now they start to have more, and then they can do the same thing for their kids and their kids. And so now the Black middle class is growing somewhat. And the members of the Black middle class are saying, oh, we got the opportunity to live over here and have this stuff, and we don't have to send our kids to overcrowded schools in the ghetto. We're going to move. And so they started to move away from the Black ghetto, and they started to move to the suburbs. But when they got there, they experienced what they call resegregation through two ways. Mary Pattillo in Black Picket Fences says that they were segregated racially because of unfair housing practices, redlining, that took place well up into the 90s. So redlining, where they weren't even allowed to get realtors to show them predominantly white spaces or spaces that were increasing in value so that they could make money and create wealth for their family. So that's the first thing. The second thing was with this resegregation that was occurring post desegregation, this resegregation was happening because as more and more Black people are now moving into these suburbs, more and more white people are saying, we don't want to live here. And they're moving even further out, or they're moving into different suburbs. So Black people are chasing the white people into the suburbs and the white people are running away. That's why it's called white flight. Whole set of scholarly research, right, that looks at white flight. So white people essentially begin to flee. And so now these Black middle class, what was white spaces, now became mixed spaces, now are Black middle class suburbs with all of the white people gone. And so there is now this resegregation, but now there's just, instead of it being segregation in the inner city, now there's segregation in the inner city and there's segregation in the suburbs. And then we're gonna talk about what happens after that part. We get to that in the end. Stay tuned. So, so whites, again, the neighborhoods, they have entered, they shun them in public, right? And so many of the Black people now are in these predominantly middle class areas. Now you do have some that are able to live in the nice homes and apartments in some of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, and they send their children to formerly white schools. So maybe some of you were people of color who went to predominantly white schools, or maybe you saw, maybe if you're identified as a white person, you had Black students, classmates, or friends, or whatever, that went to your predominantly white school. You had some parents who were able to do that. But most of the time, they moved into the neighborhoods that eventually would be all Black. It was rare, right, that a person would be the only Black person in the neighborhood for an extended period of time. And so the Black middle class, again, began to move into these spaces. Why? Because they wanted to have more access to the economic benefits of living in the United States. They wanted to have access to the nice malls, the nice stores, the nice restaurants, the so-called good schools, the beautiful churches, the places that had the appreciating land value. That is essentially the reason why the Black middle class began to move into these areas. And so as they began to move, they became more accomplished. But in terms of like phenotype, in terms of their skin color, most of them are virtually indistinguishable from Black people who reside in the ghetto. And so oftentimes when they move into these areas, right, into these areas of means, into these white middle class areas, they get profiled. They get profiled on occasion for various reasons, but particularly because they look like the people that they left, the people that were in the ghetto or in the predominantly Black areas. And so usually when they are profiled or when they are subject to discrimination, they're not being asked the question, wait, how much money do you make a year before I tell you you can't shop in the store? There's just this automatic assumption that they're not supposed to be here. And so you have that happen with kids who send their children to white schools. I've done so much research on it. I've not only read it, but just have conducted it myself. So I can go on and on and on about that. And it absolutely happens today all the time. That's probably the biggest form of discrimination that I've seen in interviews, is how much parents, when they try to send their kids to predominantly white schools, the level of hatred and vitriol that many of their kids receive, it can really bring you to tears, what some of these kids have to go through. Churches, right? And I've heard of many examples of people getting kicked out of churches or not allowed to go to churches because certain churches, because of the color of their skin, are saying, hey, the Black church is over here, you can go there, right? And so sometimes even in driving fancy cars, right, or sending their kids to private schools, wanting to have that access and have the benefits of being middle class in the US, but then get profiled because they're driving a fancy car or because they go to a private school. So because of that, members of this group are typically only one generation away from the ghetto. And so because of that, even though the Black middle class may live in these predominantly white areas, or sometimes even predominantly Black middle class areas, they're still connected to the poor and working class because many times they have an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother or a grandfather or a cousin or a mother or a father or whoever still living in the ghetto. And so you have two options for the Black middle class. One, to live in a predominantly Black middle class neighborhood that's next to the ghetto, or two, live in the exclusive white neighborhood and their children have to navigate predominantly white spaces. Either way, there's a give and take. It's there are pros and cons. And so even if they stay connected to their family members or whoever that live in the poor and working class areas or live in the ghetto, their lives are still in very much contrast to them, especially when they are enacting professional roles. But then even when they're in their professional roles, they still don't get a lot of credit when they are in those roles, right? Because sometimes people may not believe them when they say they're a doctor, or they're a lawyer, or they're an engineer, or they're a CEO, right? And so then going to the next slide, this is why, or this is where we get this notion of the iconic ghetto. And so whether a Black person is from the ghetto or the suburbs, Black skin designates them as being from the ghetto. No matter what their class status is, no matter what their skin color is, whether they're lighter skin, brown skin, darker skin. And so this is what Elijah Anderson is talking about when he's talking about the iconic ghetto. And while this is happening, the actual physical Black ghetto still persists, even though it also appears to be on the verge of self-destruction now because of deindustrialization. But actual ghettos have now been deindustrialized. So I'll just give you a quick history lesson. In the 1930s, 40s, you had factories. Even before that, you had factories popping up all over the United States, particularly in the downtown areas, big Ford, plants, steel plants, plants that made cans. I mean, just anything. And these big businesses, manufacturing hubs, were hiring poor, uneducated, or working class Black people, particularly Black men. At that time, Black men did not have the opportunity to get, most of them did not have the opportunity to get a quality education. So to go and get a degree and get a higher paying management position was highly unlikely. The only option they had were those factory jobs. And so that's where you had a majority of Black folks and white folks. So in places like Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Cincinnati, all of these, Chicago, if you were poor, working class, whether you were Black or white, it didn't matter. That was a job for you. You go, you work your 40 hours a week, you get paid, and you take care of your family. And that helped to stimulate the American economy in the 50s and in the 60s. But something happened in the 1970s. In the 1970s, William Julius Wilson said deindustrialization happened. William Julius Wilson is I think he ended up teaching at Harvard, but he was initially at the University of Chicago, sociologist, a very, very well well-known sociologist. And he said deindustrialization happened. And what happened was, as America began to move from being a manufacturing economy to a knowledge-based economy, where now people are going to school and majoring in things that where you need a certain amount of knowledge or expertise in, right? So we're moving from making money off of goods, providing services for, or goods really, to providing a service. So now instead of working with your hands in the factories, now people are majoring in psychology to provide a service, to be a psychologist, or medicine to be a doctor or whatever, right? Now we're moving to service-oriented jobs that require a specific knowledge, teachers, things like that. And so these jobs start to get shipped overseas, because now the big capitalists are starting to realize, oh, wait, I'm paying these Americans $5 an hour and I got to give them health insurance. Or I could take this hub and take it to Thailand and pay them $2 an hour with no health insurance and pocket the rest of that money. I think I'm gonna do that. And so that's essentially what happened. Deindustrialization means that the industries in these big cities started to go overseas. And so that does really good for the owner. But what happens to all those jobs? 200, 300, 500, 1,000 people that were working in those factories. What happened to them? They don't have a job. They can just get another one, but they're uneducated. They don't have that opportunity. So where do they go? It doesn't matter to me. That's what the capitalists are saying. And so because of that, now you start to see an increase in crime, and you start to see a decrease in education, a decrease in men in the family, men in the homes. You start to see an increase in crime and also an increase in drug use. And then it leads into a lot of the ghettoized conditions of the 1980s. So again, as the American economy started to change from being manufacturing industry to high technology industry, and being globalized, inner city communities, particularly inner city Black communities, were the ones that started to suffer. And so, and again, these areas were formerly sustained by these jobs. The people who also helped these communities were now moving to the suburbs. And so because of that, the notion of this iconic ghetto and how this is relating to these people who are moving over, not overseas, but moving out to the suburbs, it becomes even more complicated. These people are considered rough people. This is considered a Black ghetto. And so then what you see is now you see actual ghettos, as well as what is perceived as ghetto in the minds of white people, are now there's this creation of the iconic ghetto. Now, most people in the white space don't necessarily look on the actual or iconic ghetto from a structural lens. Most of them, when they look at the ghetto, they think, well, people are living in this position because they are lazy, because they're criminals, right? They associate the ghetto with danger and crime and poverty. That is what they associate the iconic ghetto with. They're not looking at it from a structural lens. They don't know, either they don't know or they don't care to make the connection between the story I just told you about how ghettos came to be and these people. So they're not looking at it from, oh, this was created on purpose, not because these people don't want to work. Oh, there's a high level of joblessness, unemployment or underemployment, and high influx of drugs into these communities purposely, which is why these things are happening. But without that structural lens, the iconic ghetto just seems to be something that Black people just like, or they just want, or they're just naturally, these criminals are naturally like to live in poverty. And so again, this ghetto as an icon symbolizes this distressed place to which Black people are just relegated to, apart from the larger society. And it causes this universal low opinion of Black people as a group. And then it allows for prejudice to persist, because now it's a source of stereotypes. It's a source of rationalization. It's a source of unfair legislation. It's the reason why people can say, oh, well, if they want to be here or they're just being lazy, then yeah, we can pass laws to make sure there are more police in these areas. Yeah, we can pass laws to build more prisons. Yeah, we can pass laws to, because why? Of this iconic ghetto perception. And so a significant but undetermined number of people in these larger societies, particularly people who occupy the white space, they look on these iconic ghettos with fear, with judgment. And they have these visions, these assessments, and again, ignore the structural poverty, the sociological reasons as to why the inner city ghetto exists and why people live that way. And so in these circumstances, the ghetto is poor. These people are seen as pariahs, piranhas, and they're more likely to be victimized other than to be victims themselves of the larger society. And so again, talking more about segregation, because of that, so we talked about how the ghetto came to be in like the 70s and 80s and 90s, and the ghetto continues, going to the next slide. Unfortunately, segregation did and continues to persist, particularly in the form of education and residential. And just so you don't think I was making this up, I just went and found this quick link. One of the quotes says, separate and unequal learning environments of Black and white children contributed to Black children developing a profoundly negative sense of self. That was a test done by Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1930s, which was actually the foundation for the Brown v. Board of Education ruling of segregated schools being unconstitutional. And yet, notice this part, research conducted at UCLA confirms that Black children in the South are now more likely to attend racially segregated schools than they were 50 years ago. And that's just in the South. There are other sources that show how in LA and in Detroit and in New York, that educational segregation is about the same. At least it was in like 2014, 2015. It may, I don't know if it's different now, but it was like that then. So the civil rights movement is long past, yet these things still persist. The wider society is still replete with overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, white schools, white universities, and we'll talk about the residential segregation next week with American apartheid. We can talk about that there. But for now, right, yeah, restaurants, schools, universities, workplaces, churches, there's so much research, particularly around education and residents, as to how the segregation still exists. And so these are perceived as white spaces. And Elijah Anderson says, and they must be handled with care, because when they are allowed to be in these spaces, Black people typically have to be absent. They're not expected or they're marginalized when they're present. So in turn, Black people often refer to these spaces again as white. And their idea, this idea of white space, is another perceptual category. The iconic ghetto is a perception and white space is a perception. And they typically approach that space very, very carefully. The difference is the iconic ghetto is a perception, based on stereotypes, based on, yeah, stereotypes, without a structural analysis. The white space is seen as a white space. That's perceived based on reality and what it is that Black people go through when they enter into areas or spaces where it's clear that they're not supposed to be there or they're not wanted there. And so the question is, how do Black people navigate this space? How do Black people navigate the white space? One thing is, when present in the white space, Black people start to reflect the proportion of white to Black people. In other words, they ask the question, how many Black people gonna be there? Or when they go, they kind of look and see, well, not a lot of Black people here. Or, oh, it's some Black people here. Okay, cool. And if you're a person of color, if you're a Black person, you know what I'm talking about. Right? They may look around and see if there are other Black people that they can commune with, that they can bond with. Again, this isn't every person. I don't want to act as if being Black is a monolithic experience. There are some people that may genuinely not care, or may not do that, or may never do that. But I think Elijah Anderson is talking about what most people do, what he's seen most Black people do, and based on the experiences from interviews. And before he wrote this book, he wrote like 5 before that, where he actually did scientific interviews or collected scientific data in Philly. He did most of his work in Philly because he worked at UPenn. I think he did 2. He wrote 2 in Philly, Code of the Street, and A Place on the Corner. And I think he did like 2 other books. And then this is kind of like how Du Bois, when he did Souls of Black Folk, he's taking all of what he's seen around Black people in space. Oh, the cosmopolitan canopy. And then now he's writing white space. So this isn't just based on, oh, he's just making this stuff up. No, he did research. And he took about two decades, because he's been writing since the 80s. And he wrote this, I think, in 2015 or something like that. So he's been doing this for a while. So, so again, looking at how Black people will check the percentage of Black people and or other minorities. So a lot of Black people, are there other people of color? Okay, maybe I can kick it with that. Another thing they may do, they may bring a Black person with them. Hey, come with me to this thing. I just don't know who all there. So come with me. Or are there spaces where Black people can escape to? These are the things that measure the comfort level of Black people when they have to navigate white space. And then with the bring a Black person with you, okay, I can bring 1 or 2, but I can't bring too many, because then there might be too many of us and then they might feel threatened. So I might just bring 1 or 2 of my best friends and then that's it. Or when Black people choose a school. I just had a friend of mine who graduated from the University of Wisconsin. Now she's working as an assistant professor in Pennsylvania. She just did research on this, found that Black people around college readiness. And she found that African-American students choose colleges based on partly around the Black spaces that are available at predominantly white institutions. I've also seen this myself in working at predominantly white institutions. I've seen Black students come and within a semester they leave. Why? Because they're like, there's nowhere for Black people to go. So they go back home or they go to another institution that has more Black people. And so these are things that Black folks tend to do when they're trying to navigate white space. They're trying to see their level of ease and see the level of off-limitedness that exists in that space. However, the same settings are generally regarded for white people as what? These 2 white settings can be off limits for Black people, but how do white people see these settings? What do they call it? Normal. Normal. It's life. So that's why, generally speaking, a lot of white people, when they enter into these settings, they don't even notice. They may not even notice the lack of minority or people of color. They may not notice the lack of Black people or whatever, because to them, this is life. This is what they've always seen. And so that's why it takes a sociological lens, a sociological imagination. That's why you take these classes, to then be able for people's eyes to open and see the world from other people's lenses. So while operating in the white space, again, Black people are subject to social, if not physical, jeopardy. They navigate these white spaces and they risk some penalty, some punitive transgression, in trying to conduct themselves in an ordinary way while also being Black at the same time. So there are these punishments for negative actions or perceptions in a white space, even if they didn't do anything wrong, even if they're just being normal. But because the iconic ghetto hovers over the idea of white space, Black space, white identity, and Black identity, there's this social plateau that foreshadows certain evaluations. And they have little to do with who the person is or what they're doing in actuality. But when you're moving into a white space, Black people have to endure these challenges all the time of how they navigate it, how comfortable they're going to feel, but then they also have to measure the comfortability of white people in that space, particularly white people of authority. And so this is the dynamics and the complexities of navigating white space. Other things that Black people tend to have to do when they're navigating white space is they have to perform in a way that can lead them to move past, it can lead them to either pass or fail certain inspections. So depending on how well the Black person is performing, the white person may say, okay, you can stay. For example, the Black guy in the store in the video, he had the right costume on, he had the right performance. So he wasn't harassed. That's what he said. If I wear this, I may not get harassed. I still might, but I might not. I'm less likely, at least, than if I wear my normal clothing. So these are the performances that Black people have to make sure they participate in order to pass these inspections. And then they might have provisional acceptance into the white space. But other people may need to prove additionally why they have to be in that space. And again, this happens in, like in the video, in upscale restaurants, and in shopping malls, grocery stores, right? So they have to demonstrate essentially that the ghetto stereotype does not apply to them. Because as soon as they're seen, it is this idea that they represent the iconic ghetto. And so a lot of times what happens is in these public white spaces, like in the upscale shops or in the restaurants, a lot of Black people take this sort of racial profiling in stride. They know it's probably going to come. They expect it. They treat it as a way of life. They go about their business just hoping that it doesn't happen, but they know it probably will. And even though there has been positive change and social change and growth in the Black middle class, this is still the case. It's just a new type of discrimination, different kind of discrimination. And so then what happens is eventually, when Black people experience this enough in their reality, they start to become cynical of the larger system. So then people ask the question, well, why are they so angry? Why don't they want to come over here? Well, how come they're so standoffish? Well, when you've experienced that since you were 8 or 9, all the way up until your 20s or 30s, sometimes it just gets overwhelming. And you kind of say, okay, there's nothing going to change. I think we talked about Du Bois with this as well. I can't remember if we mentioned this in this class or another class, but Du Bois, he eventually got cynical of the system as well. First black person with a Ph.D. from Harvard. Fought all his life for equality. He was in his 80s, 70s or 80s or something, and said, I'll give up and moved to Ghana. Said, I can't do this anymore. This is just crazy. So yeah, eventually the black person will become cynical of the larger system. They come to the realization that common courtesies will never be extended to them. Their faith in the system gets eroded, and they become cynical. The realizations don't, now these things don't happen overnight. Right? Usually it's gradual, sometimes months, years and years of these experiences, these observations, these stories over and over again makes them conclude, you know what, the game is rigged. just no matter what, no matter how much money I have, I just won't be treated as equal just because of the color of my skin. And so they then just become cynical. And how did we see this in the video? How did you see that in the video? It was there. All right. The difference, and maybe one of the things you might have said in the beginning, was the way white people and black people responded. The white people were able to kind of leave. Even the ones that didn't say anything could just leave if they felt uncomfortable and go to another white space. Black people couldn't necessarily do that. Even if you leave that black space, you now are still entering into another. At some point, you got to enter into it. You don't have to go to that particular white space, but you're going to have to go into another white space at some point. So there's no escaping it. This is life in the United States. And so because of that, going to the next slide, they have to create some responses. One, avoid white space as soon as possible. They may try to avoid it altogether, right? By saying, okay, if I have to enter it, I'll enter, do what I have to do, and then get out. And then sometimes when white people leave a white space, they feel relieved, or sometimes they may regret it because maybe they left prematurely. Because if they're honest, white spaces can give you certain rewards, economic and social rewards. You get certain levels of education, you might get a job, there's certain privileges, prestige, money, promise of acceptance. So there are these rewards for being in white space. But the challenge is, what is it going to have to sacrifice? What do I have to sacrifice for? My dignity, my self-respect, constant subjugation, sending my kids to a white school, sure. There may be some rewards, but is it worth constant being putting down, teachers mistreating them, getting called every other day that my child's been suspended or written up for something small that other children aren't getting suspended or written up for? Is it worth it? And every Black person has to decide if they're in a space that is perpetuating that. And so these are the responses that a lot of Black people have. You have Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I put her story up here if you wanted to read it. She was a tenure track professor at the University of North Carolina. She did a phenomenal rollout called the 1619 Project in 2019. It was exactly 400 years since Black people first came to the United States as enslaved people. And it was phenomenal. I mean, it was all over the New York Times. It was all over the world. They were teaching. I was teaching it in my classes. Professors were teaching it everywhere. This 1619 Project was huge. And it was incredible. I mean, just a layout of the history of slavery in America, phenomenal. And she wasn't tenured yet. And so she went up for tenure shortly after, I think last year. She went up for tenure in 2020 at UNC, and they denied her. And it went viral everywhere. People all over Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, everybody. How can you not offer Nicole Hannah Jones tenure? And it's not like she's getting tenure at Harvard. Harvard is hard to get tenure, especially if you're Black. It's real hard. They're notorious for making it very difficult for people of color to get tenure, i.e. Cornel West, i.e. some of his colleagues. Okay. So, but it wasn't even hard. It wasn't even Harvard. It was UNC, a good school, but it's not hard. It wouldn't. Somebody who does work like that should easily be able to get tenure. They denied her tenure. Most people believe it was because of racism. North Carolina, it's in the South, still very much a conservative state. Probably didn't like the fact that this 1619 project didn't make white people feel too good about the history of slavery in America. So they got pushback from all over the country. They reevaluated, came back and said, okay, we'll offer Dr. Jones tenure. She said, thank you, but I declined. And she ended up getting a large grant. She got a lot of research dollars, I think like in the millions. And she ended up leaving UNC. And now she's teaching at Howard University, a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. And she explains why she left. And the reason why was largely because of what Elijah Anderson says, that these white spaces are places where Black people navigate to try to find a sense of humanity, to try to make a difference. And when they feel they are not appreciated, then they leave those white spaces, or they try to avoid it again altogether, or leave it as soon as possible. And I think she said something about going where you're celebrated, not where you're tolerated. Something along those lines. She talks about in her response to why she did not accept tenure at University of North Carolina. Right. So looking at her story and looking at her response is just a real life example of what Elijah Anderson is conceptualizing in this piece. So the next slide, which is the last slide about information. Remember I was talking about Black people moving from the inner city, they move to the suburbs, you have the white flight, then white folks leave there, they move to what they call exurbia, so they move to the outside of the suburbs. But then I said, but there's another part to it. What you start to see in the latter part of the 20th century and in the 21st century is gentrification. So now you have white people who are living in white spaces. They're now what? They're now desiring Black spaces. They see the cities. They see the way the cities look. They're beautiful, big buildings, stores, markets. I can just walk to the store. I can just walk to the parks. Oh, can't do that in the suburbs. You got to drive everywhere. Oh, I think I want to live there. Well, that's where the inner city poor Black people are. So they start to slowly but surely move into those areas. And when they move back into those inner city areas, what happens to the housing values and the land values? They go up. And now those poor Black people and working class Black people that live there, they can't afford it anymore because they can't afford the taxes. Because they can't afford the taxes, now they're dislocated. And now Black space becomes what? White space. So only a few years ago, Black people were the dominant presence in a particular area. And at night, they sometimes still are, especially when white people first start to gentrify an area. They'll come around it in the daytime, and at night, and I've seen this for myself, doing a lot of activist work in various cities. At night, when we start to shut down, all the white people start to go inside, and then that's when you see all the poor Black people outside. And then white people defer to the presence of black people in public around that time when the police are not so visible. And then the white people tend to be more especially guarded. And then newly arrived white people start to enter into those areas. And most whites at that point, the more whites that come into a black space, they become more emboldened. And then when they start to open up restaurants, breweries, markets, especially a Whole Foods, what do you call it? The coffee spot, Starbucks. Now there's a cultural and economic manifestation going on in these areas. And now there's this major shift from black space to white space. Cycle starts all over again. So in conclusion, the civil rights movement opened its gates. Black middle class emerged. They begin to enter white space. Then you have this new form of symbolic racism coming out of this iconic ghetto perception that now stigmatizes both the black middle class and the black poor and working class. And it informs how they navigate the larger white space of America on a macro level and on an individual level. So your assignment, web assignment, white space. In this link, 2 black men were arrested. There's 2 black men, they're teenagers. They're arrested because they were accused of stealing a car, right? So the cops pulled these kids over because they were driving this really nice car in a nice part of California. And so that's where it starts. I just want to give you the backstory. So when you click the link, you see what's happening. Okay. Now I want you to watch this link. This is real short, but I think it gets you to the point. And it gives you a lot to think about because it's literally a lot of what we've talked about in just this one clip from this show. So in a 1 to 2 page paper, I want you to explain how some parts of the lecture on white space can be seen in this clip from this show. Literally, and I don't want you to just say, I see the iconic ghetto when he did this. Explain it, give me detail so that you're showing me that you have a knowledge of the material. How do you see the concept of the iconic ghetto played out in this clip? Not just one sentence. That's why I say 1 to 2 pages, because I want you to give me details. I want you to say in the slide, you know, Professor Grant, we talked about this, and I can see that in this part of the clip when the person did this, or when the person did this. This reminded me of what we talked about in this part of the lecture, which is actually very significant to what we saw in the video with it. Now you're showing me that you can put the pieces together. That's what I like to see. That's what's going to get you an A. Okay. And even better, if you can make connections to even other readings. Now I'm really excited. Because now you're showing me that you know you're getting something out of this class. Okay. So that's what I want to see. So for those who are watching this, for those who don't watch the lecture videos and they're just reading the PowerPoints, then you're going to miss all this goodness. But if you're actually watching this all the way to the end, then you get a better understanding of what I'm looking for. So that's how you get an A on these assignments. How did class play a role in how the parents were able to combat racism by the police? So we see the parents are of a certain means when they're dealing with these cops. How did class play a role? Talk about it. Make a connection. We've been talking about the black middle class for the past hour and some change. Make that connection. Show me. What did I say in the lecture that you see in the video, that you see and show me that you really understand this material. Okay. All right. The paper should be double spaced, Times New Roman, 12 font, and the only information that should be at the top of the page is your name, the name of the class, and the title of the essay, which is optional. The deadline for uploading this assignment to the web assignment portal is September 24th at 3 p.m. All right, I think next week, Harlem World, chapter 2, Spatializing Blackness, I believe, and American apartheid. So that's what you're going to be looking at there. Any questions? Email, inbox, office hours. I'm enjoying students coming in the office hours and the conversations that we've been having. If you have any questions or you just want to talk about the class, feel free. And I hope you have a great day, great week, and great weekend.